Okay. Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. It has taken me a while to make this video. I am aware of that. I have been a little bit busy publishing my debut novel. But now with that out of the way, I am finally ready to finish this trilogy. Excuse me. As usual, I will do a detailed plot summary before moving on to the discussion. You can find all of the timestamps listed in the description below. Now, don't forget to make yourself a nice cup of tea or any other beverage of your choice. And let's get into The Lord of the Rings final installment, The Return of the King. The book starts off with Gandalf riding with Pippin for several days before reaching Minas Tirith. They make their way swiftly through the city towards Lord Denethor, Steward of Gondor, who also happens to be Boromir's father. As you can imagine, he is devastated about the news of his son's death. Pippin feels guilty as Boromir had died trying to protect him and Merry from the orcs, so he offers his service to Denethor as a kind of gesture of gratitude. After some interrogation from Lord Denethor, Gandalf and Pippin are taken to their guest room. Gandalf then goes off on his own to find Faramir, whom we know is the second son of Denethor, and asks Pippin to go and check up on Shadowfax at the stables in the meantime. What follows is a fairly dull segment where we follow Pippin as he's visiting Shadowfax and then chatting to another guard and getting to know him. And then they go and have a picnic, and then they go to the lunch hall, and then he visits Shadowfax again, and then he meets up with that guard's son and gets a little tour. It's just very long-winded and nothing important happens here. Simply put, tension is rising in the city and they are just waiting for a battle to begin. Then we switch perspectives to Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli in Rohan. They meet the Grey Company, Aragorn's fellow rangers from the north, and together they join the Rohan army and continue towards Gondor. Aragorn decides to take the parts of the dead with Legolas and Gimli. For some reason they say their goodbyes to everyone, but then they share a meal with them before they actually leave. Aragorn, Legolas and Gimli go back to Edoras and tell Lady Eowyn of their plans. She begs Aragorn not to go, as it is said that no living man can pass through there. She approaches him once more before he goes to bed that night, questioning his decision. When he doesn't change his mind, Eowyn then asks to come with him, but Aragorn says that her duty is in Edoras. She goes on to say that she wants to see battle and glory, and she does not fear death. Aragorn is unmoved, saying that she has no business going south. But Eowyn replies that neither does any of the others that go with him. They go because they want to be with him and they love him. And then she leaves. Next morning, as they are about to depart, Eowyn is dressed in armor and begs on her knees to go with him, but Aragorn is firm in his decision and they leave her behind. Eventually they reach the haunted mountain and enter through the dark door. As they pass through the cold cave, ghosts of men begin to follow them. They eventually come out through the other side, and Aragorn asks them why they have come, and they reply, "To fulfill our oath," and with that they ride towards the Gondorian city of Pelargir. Then we switch to Merry's POV as he is riding with the riders of Rohan towards Gondor. Eowyn then meets up with them and tells them about Aragorn taking the parts of the dead, and they are all pretty much horrified. Then it is time to march. King Theoden wants Merry to stay behind, which makes Merry ashamed and disappointed. But a rider he does not know, who presents themselves as Dernhelm, Dernhelm? Dernhelm. They whisper to Merry that he can take him on his horse, and off they go. Then it is back to Pippin's POV, where he's having breakfast with Gandalf. A sad loaf of bread with very little butter. Pippin is in a sour mood and asks why he was even brought there. You know quite well, says Gandalf, to keep you out of mischief, and if you do not like being here, you can remember that you brought it on yourself. We do like Gandalf's no-nonsense moments. So, Faramir has finally come back to Minas Tirith after his mission in Ithilien. They have a council meeting with Lord Denethor where he tells them about the movements of the enemy. He also says that he met 2 hobbits in Ithilien and that they went by the Cirith Ungol road, which had Gandalf upset and worried. Denethor became angry that his son didn't bring him back the ring, and then sends Faramir to the city of Osgiliath to defend their borders, and they part ways in bitterness. Faramir and his men are quickly outnumbered as the enemy forces push closer to Minas Tirith. Gandalf warns Denethor that the King of Angmar, Lord of the Nazgul, has joined the battle, but Denethor just makes an offhand remark like, "You'll handle that one, Gandalf." The remaining of Faramir's men retreat, and Faramir is brought to his father, injured and dying. Denethor has him put on a bed in his council chamber and sit by his side in silence. Minas Tirith is now officially besieged. Orcs are surrounding the city. Denethor refuses to leave his son, saying that he might still speak before he dies. He's crying and has given up all hope and gives the command of the city over to Gandalf. After a while, Denethor falls into despair and decides to make a funeral pyre for his son and himself. Pippin considers him a madman and runs to find Gandalf to put a stop to it, as Faramir's life can still be saved. He finds Gandalf down by the entrance to the city, where the enemy has just blasted open the city gates. Facing Gandalf, we have the Lord of the Nazgul, and they are roasting each other pretty much. And then, for some reason, a rooster is crowing somewhere, and then that is followed by the horns of Rohan. Help has finally arrived. Now, back to Merry. He is with the riders of Rohan on their way to Minas Tirith. They arrive from the north and charge towards Mordor's armies. The Battle of Pelennor Fields has begun. As King Theoden fights and slays many enemies, his horse is struck by an arrow and he falls. That is when the Lord of the Nazgul approach him on his flying lizard beast. As Merry is witnessing this, the soldier he thought to be Dernhelm is challenging the Nazgul, who tells the soldier not to get in between the Nazgul and his prey. And so we get to the epic girl power moment. "Hinder me, thou fool, no living man can hinder me. But no living man am I, you look upon a woman. Eowyn am I, Eomund's daughter. You stand between me and my lord and kin. Begone, if you be not deathless, for living or dark undead, I will smite you if you touch him." Almost a bit poetic. The Nazgul attacks her, but she kills his beast swiftly by cutting off its head. Dismounted, the Nazgul now attacks her with his mace, shattering her shield and breaking her arm. As he leans over her, ready to finish her off, Merry sneaks up behind him and stabs him in the back with his sword. Eowyn then drives her sword right between the Nazgul's crown and mantle, officially killing him. And then she collapses. Merry looks over at King Theoden, who's dying, and they exchange some friendly words, and the king asks for Eomer, as he will now be king when he dies. He also wants a word sent to Eowyn, Apparently he didn't see the heroic deeds she did to defend him earlier. But alas, he never finds out about them either, as he is dead before Merry can tell him about it. Eomer then leads the Rohan army against a new force, this time riding elephants, although here they call them Mumakil. Even more enemies are upon them as Mordor got reinforcements both from land and sea, causing the defenders of Gondor to lose all hope. But things were not as they seemed. From the ships that docked came no enemy, but Aragorn along with his friends and reinforcements from other parts of Gondor. Eomer rejoiced, and so did the rest of the Rohan army, and hope was rekindled. Soon enough, the enemy was thwarted, and Aragorn, now riding as the King of Gondor, had led his people to victory. Then we go back to Pippin's POV. He brings Gandalf to save Faramir from being burned by Denethor. Denethor then shows his Palantir, saying that he has seen more than they think. He then runs back inside, lays down on the funeral pyre with his Palantir. He sets himself on fire and burns to death. Faramir, thankfully, was saved and is brought to the healing house. After the battle, Merry followed Eowyn into Minas Tirith. She was brought to the Houses of Healing, but he accidentally wanders off as if sleepwalking. Pippin found him in an alleyway and, with Gandalf's help, brought him to the Houses of Healing as well. Both Merry and Eowyn suffer from a kind of dark shadow dream that is caused by the Nazgul and are close to dying. But Aragorn now enters the city and the healing house, saying that he can help them if he's given some Athelas. After a bit of back and forth, they find a few Athelas leaves and gives them over to Aragorn, and he does some ritual with them, first over Faramir, then Eowyn, and then Merry. And they all wake up. I think it's rather funny that the first thing that Faramir said when waking up was to greet his new king, and Eowyn rejoiced at seeing her brother Eomer, and the first thing that Merry said when waking up was, "I'm hungry." I can relate. So after all of the healing, it was time for Aragorn to rest in his battle tent that he had set up outside the city. He doesn't want to act on his claim to the throne before it is certain that the Free Peoples are victorious against Mordor. The next day, Legolas and Gimli enter the city to see Merry and Pippin. They catch up with them and tell them about the battle they had at Pelargir, the one that the reader did not see. And it was only after that victory that they had access to the enemy ships that took them to Minas Tirith. The army of the dead had helped them there, and once they had finished, they had vanished. In the meantime, Aragorn holds council with Gandalf and the other lords on the next move. They decide to continue distracting Sauron by marching on the Black Gate of Mordor, hopefully giving Frodo and Sam the time they need to destroy the ring. They leave about 2 days later, led by Aragorn and Gandalf. The whole gang is there, apart from Merry, who was still healing. It took them 5 days to reach the Black Gate, and once they had arrived, all the remaining Nazguls was hovering over the towers, watching them, but there was no sign of their main enemy. They unfurled the banner of Aragorn, King of Gondor, and formally challenged the Lord of the Black Land. A lieutenant came out to meet them, introducing himself as the Mouth of Sauron. He said he had some tokens to show them, and he held up one of the short swords that Sam had carried, and one grey cloak with an elven brooch, as well as the mithril shirt that Frodo had worn. Pippin made a cry of grief, thereby confirming that they knew what these items meant. The Mouth of Sauron continues to talk about the stupidity of sending these little folk as spies into Mordor. And he goes on to name Sauron's terms. that they will be allowed to leave as long as certain lands are given over to Sauron, and that oaths will be sworn to never again take up arms against him. But Gandalf simply blinds him with the shine of his white robes, takes the items from him, and formally declines Sauron's terms. The gates of Mordor opened, and a great host came out to meet their challenge. The battle starts, and little Pippin decides to do his best. And he does somehow manage to single-handedly kill a troll, but then he passes out. Then we go back in time a little bit, shifting back to Sam's POV. Sam is now outside the tower of Cirith Ungol, a settlement on the cliffside just after the great spider Shelob's lair. He puts on the ring and wondering how to proceed as he needs to go on to save Frodo. But the ring made his vision blurry and he took it off again. That is when he sees Mount Doom in the distance, as well as the menace that was Barad-dûr, the Tower of Sauron. Sam feels the ring tempting him. It shows him the option of taking it for his own and claim lordship over these lands. But Sam had no desire to be a powerful ruler, and he resisted these thoughts with the help of his plain hobbit sense, as well as his love for Frodo. He would need to continue to try and save him, but he knew now that he could not put on the ring ever again from this point forward. He manages to get inside the gate, but some gargoyle-like statues raise the alarm. Let's just go with that. Luckily for Sam, most of the orcs there are already dead, thanks to some good old infighting. And the few orcs that he does meet along the way, they cower in fear at the sight of him, so he fights them off with relative ease. Apparently, this was because he had the ring in his possession, which has tremendous power over a servant of Mordor. He goes on to search for Frodo and has trouble finding him, so he sits down and sings a song, as you do, and thankfully finds him soon thereafter. They have a joyous reunion, but soon after their shared relief, Frodo tells Sam in despair that the orcs took everything on his body, meaning the ring as well, and the quest had therefore failed. Sam then shows him that he, in fact, had the ring, and Frodo's face quickly changed as he saw it again. He demands that Sam gives it to him, to which Sam feels a little bit reluctant, but he still takes it off and hands it over to his master. After Sam has found them some orc gear to disguise themselves with, they make their way out of the tower. They narrowly manage to avoid the orcs running towards the tower, as having heard the gargoyle alarm again as they left. On they went for a days-long hike over the mountain ridge, passing further into Mordor. Every now and then they had to hide from passing orcs, and at one point when Sam was scouting for water, he saw the silhouette of Gollum closing in on Frodo where he was sleeping, but he managed to chase him off. As they had crossed the mountain ridge and was now down on the barren plains, a troop of orcs passed them, and their leader forced them to join their ranks, believing them to be orcs. This was, of course, really bad, but Sam got the idea to start a brawl, and once they were at the bottom of a pile of orcs, they managed to crawl away from all the turmoil. After resting a while, they continued their journey south towards Mount Doom. In the timeline, this is when Aragorn and the others were riding towards the Black Gate, and they continued like this for days, and they grew weaker with each day that passed. They are now just below the mountain and decide to cast off anything that they are not sure to need, meaning the orc disguise and weapons, and Sam even had to let go of his cooking gear. Thus began the last stage of their journey, going up the rumbling, fuming mountain while suffering from extreme exhaustion, hunger, and thirst. Frodo eventually collapsed, and Sam proceeded to carry him up the slope of the mountain. That is when they are attacked by Gollum, and this triggers some extra determination in Frodo. He fights off Gollum and commands that he leaves him. Frodo then continues walking further into the mountain, leaving Sam to deal with Gollum. But Gollum managed to plead for mercy, and Sam finds himself understanding why Gollum is the way he is, having himself carried the ring, albeit for a little while. Sam follows Frodo into the dark forge of Sauron and finds Frodo standing there by the crack of Mount Doom. Frodo declares that he cannot, will not do the deed that they came there to do, and claims the ring for his own. Sam is then attacked from behind and passes out for a moment, but when he wakes up, he sees Gollum fighting something invisible just by the edge. Gollum then bites off Frodo's finger, finally getting his precious back. In Gollum's joy, however, he accidentally topples over the edge, falling into the fire, taking the ring with him to his death. The mountain began to shake and fire leaped up to the roof of the chamber. Sam picked up Frodo and carried him out of the door. Frodo was himself again and told him that if Gollum had not fought him for the ring, he would never have been able to let it go. So they should forgive him, for the quest is achieved and now it is all over. The book, however, is far from over. As the volcano of the mountain erupts, Sam and Frodo are caught in a rain of ash and a river of lava. They eventually pass out from all the smoke inhalation, and when Sam wakes up again, he's in a comfy bed under a tree. Gandalf was there watching over them, and he and Frodo have a joyful reunion with all of their old friends. They were in a field in Ithilien where the host had made camp after the last battle, and they held a feast there that night to celebrate the victory. We then go back in time yet again, and are now back in Minas Tirith as Captain Faramir and Lady Éowyn are in the Houses of Healing, worried at the lack of news from the battle. Faramir falls in love with her quite quickly, but Éowyn still seems to carry a torch for Aragorn. She continues to spend time with Faramir, however, and as the days pass, her feelings begin to change. After they are reached by the news that the battle is over, Faramir confronts her about his feelings for her. They have a somewhat awkward but interesting conversation about her unrequited love for Aragorn and why she is so drawn to him. In the end, however, she accepted Faramir's proposal and seemed happy with that decision. So then Aragorn and the others return to Minas Tirith as the victorious army. Everyone is celebrated and he is crowned king. He makes Faramir Prince of Ithilien, as he would have had lordship over Gondor had Aragorn not claimed his rightful place as king. The Fellowship stayed in Minas Tirith for a while, as Aragorn wanted them by his side for a particular event. And soon enough, a company of elves arrived in the city, including Galadriel of Lothlorien and Elrond of Rivendell, along with his daughter Arwen. Aragorn and Arwen got married, and all was well and good. As Frodo speaks with Aragorn and Arwen, Arwen tells him that she will not sail into the west with the other elves. Instead, should he wish it, Frodo can have her place, and she gives him the Evenstar necklace. So they all go to Rohan and hold a funeral feast for King Theoden, after which the new king, Éomer, announced his sister's engagement with Captain Faramir. Then, of course, Legolas kept his promise to Gimli, and together they made visits to the glittering caves of Helm's Deep. Then the whole company continued towards Isengard, where they met Treebeard. They find out that he let Saruman go, apparently, as he doesn't like to cage living things. But why was he appointed prison guard then, is my question. And this has Gandalf worried, rightfully so. Here the company is split up, some go south, others west, and Legolas and Gimli alone continue towards Fangorn Forest. At some point along the road, they run into Saruman and Wormtongue, who look like a couple of dirty beggars, pretty much. Saruman is still as charming and cheerful as ever before. Eventually they reach Rivendell, where the hobbits have a lovely reunion with Bilbo. Bilbo said something about having been invited to the wedding at Minas Tirith, but then there was so much packing and... Typical old person comment. After about 2 weeks there, they decide to go home and Gandalf goes with them. They travel at a slow pace, eventually getting to Bree, where they meet old Barliman Butterbur again. We learn that things are pretty bad around Bree and the Shire, with many ruffians and thugs about. And yeah, Gandalf leaves the hobbits to go and see Tom Bombadil, and Frodo, Sam, Merry and Pippin continue by themselves to the Shire. They find it occupied by ruffians who claim to be under the leadership of some mysterious figure called Sharky. But Frodo and the gang are bold now, and they rally the other hobbits to organize a coup to take back the Shire. They are victorious and continue towards Frodo's old house, where the mysterious Sharky is residing. Lo and behold, Sharky is none other than Saruman. They tell him to leave and he agrees with this. He takes Wormtongue with him, but Saruman insults him so much that Wormtongue actually attacks him and slits his throat. Several hobbits shot him with arrows, however, so now he's dead too. And now it is time for a cleanup. After everything has been restored to its former glory, Frodo asks Sam if he wants to move in with him at Bag End. Sam is conflicted, as he wants to marry his sweetheart Rosie Cotton, and so Frodo invites them both to come and live with him. And so they do. I thought that was rather sweet. 2 years go by and Sam and Rosie now have a baby girl, and one day Frodo asks Sam to come with him for a small trip, assuring him that he will be back with his beloved family within a fortnight. They take to the road, eventually meeting up with Lord Elrond, Galadriel, Bilbo, as well as some other elves. Frodo reveals to Sam that they are going to the Grey Havens and that he will leave Middle-earth with them. But he named Sam as his heir. That was a really sweet moment that made me tear up a little. They ride on to the Grey Havens, where they meet Gandalf by the ship at the docks. As they are there, Merry and Pippin arrive suddenly, saying that Gandalf had told them about what was happening. I mean, honestly, Frodo, were you just not going to tell Merry and Pippin that you're leaving Middle-earth? Regardless, Frodo kissed his friends goodbye and they watched as the ship disappeared beyond the western horizon. Then Merry, Pippin and Sam returned back to the Shire. The end. As most fantasy fans are surely aware of, Lord of the Rings has become kind of like the blueprint for the epic fantasy saga, with tropes that have by now become quite mainstream for the genre. I mean tropes like the unlikely hero or the chosen one, the old mentor who eventually dies, the exiled king who has to reclaim his throne, or the magical object that has to be kept from the villain. And the list goes on. If we look at fantasy stories written after Lord of the Rings, we will find many similar tropes in various combinations. It's easy to think that Tolkien himself came up with these, but many of them can be found in ancient tales and stories that date further back than what can be determined by written records. One example in particular would be the Mabinogi, that is a collection of old Irish stories, but there are countless of examples really. What I loved about The Lord of the Rings is how similar it feels to these old stories, and it gives it a kind of air of authenticity. Like you have no difficulty tricking yourself into thinking that Middle-earth is real and what you are reading is like a history book. And I really like that. Up until that point, anything fantasy-like had been written mainly for children, but Lord of the Rings is a story for adults, and that is very clear from the start. While The Hobbit is more of a children's book, Lord of the Rings is a heavy read, I would say, even for an adult. It's difficult to explain, but it has this strange sense of realism to it. Firstly, because you cannot read this without being given the occasional history lesson, but the realism goes into the story itself as well. There are so many quiet moments in the story, all of those in-between moments that an editor today would probably just scratch as it ruins the pacing. For example, following Pippin around Minas Tirith where nothing at all happens, or following Frodo as he spends like an hour waiting for Sam to go and find them some orc clothes. Again, where nothing happens. But keeping these moments here brings an element of realism, and these books would not be the same without those. There's like an extra added layer of immersion, if you know what I mean. I think this is the biggest difference for me between Lord of the Rings and other epic fantasy books written today, because there is this formula today that requires every single thing to serve a purpose to the story. There is literally no room for quiet moments, which is quite sad, but I suppose that also makes this trilogy a little bit more special. Now, let's talk about romance, or rather the lack thereof. I was shocked to find how little we see of Arwen in these books. I already knew that her role was greatly extended in the movies, but I had no idea just how much. We barely see her at all, and she speaks like 2 sentences in the entire trilogy. Her being described as breathtakingly beautiful by every man who sees her is not enough to make me ship this couple. I'm not saying I need a meet cute and some lingering looks and sunset walks on the beach. Okay, I admit that I might be a little bit gushy when it comes to romance. Don't judge me. But I do feel a bit cheated by how their relationship was handled. I wanted more. What I did like, however, was Éowyn and Faramir. Although mostly because of Éowyn. I like her. She has an interesting personality and a strong sense of self. And I really liked those 3 or 4 pages where their relationship develops from the first meeting to her accepting his proposal. At least it was more than what we got from Aragorn and Arwen. One thing that was particularly interesting was that in those 3 or 4 pages, Éowyn goes through some heavy soul-searching. She questions why she wanted Aragorn and realizes she wanted him for the wrong reasons. She had wanted to be queen, to be part of his glory and honor. But as she experienced Faramir's love for her, she realized that there was more to life than glory. Sure, it was more of an insta-love, but we'll take what we can get at this point. I quite liked her arc, and I think it would have made an interesting story on its own. Now, I do know that there's the Sam and Rosie Cotton romance to talk about as well, but I am saving this for my next video, which will be talking about the differences between the books and the movies, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you haven't subscribed yet, then please do, as that would really make me super happy. As I've mentioned before, these books are split into two separate perspectives. Part 1 follows Aragorn and the other members of the Fellowship, and Part 2 follows Frodo and Sam. And throughout the Sam and Frodo part, we follow Sam's perspective most of the time, meaning the reader is inside his head, hearing his thoughts. Of course, this makes sense, as Frodo is usually either too tired or unconscious or kidnapped by orcs. And it continues this way even after Sam and Frodo flee the tower and go further into Mordor. We stay in Sam's perspective. And honestly, Frodo is quite unlikable at this point. He is just complaining about how tired he is, and he's really quite rude to Sam. Sam literally has to do everything. If it wasn't for him, Frodo would have been dead long ago. He wouldn't even have made it into Mordor. Sam really is the definition of the unheralded hero, in my opinion. But make no mistake, it was far from easy for Sam to do all of this. He's close to giving up multiple times, especially as he sees Frodo getting increasingly worse. As the reader, we follow Sam's various stages of fear, determination, and courage. He is not fearless, quite the opposite. Especially after he has rejected the temptation of the ring, he is practically consumed by fear, but he goes on anyway. That is what makes a true hero in my eyes. I can't help but wonder if the reason why Frodo was slacking so much was because Sam was there. That he knew deep down that Sam would make sure that they got to Mount Doom. Because if it was him alone, maybe he would have found some last reserve of determination to see it through. After all, when he was attacked by Gollum, he did find it within himself to fight back. But that is just me speculating. Regardless, I think Sam deserved so much more praise in the end than he got. But at least he was given a very happy ending, and that is what truly matters after all. Speaking of endings, if you thought that the movie had many endings, it is nowhere near what the book has. There's close to 100 pages left of story after the ring has been destroyed. I'm not saying that the ring being destroyed would be a good place to end it, definitely not, but it gives some idea of how long the ending part of the book really is. Because the ring is the main conflict of the story. Once that is over and done with, all you have left is wrapping up loose ends. And when you have a giant cast of characters like Lord of the Rings has, you tend to have a lot of loose ends. So what I'm saying is that it's okay to learn of what happened to Aragorn and Faramir and Eowyn and Legolas and Gimli and all of them. But I think we could have done without the scouring of the Shire. Honestly, Saruman was defeated in the Two Towers. He did not need to come back for a brief stint in the Shire, especially since getting rid of him proved to be no challenge whatsoever. I did like, however, that the book deals with trauma. Regardless of how I feel about Frodo in general, he did suffer a great trauma from carrying the ring for such a long time and eventually falling to its temptation. It is a magical trauma, one could say. And we are told that Frodo falls ill for one day twice a year. It is on the anniversary of when he was stabbed on Weathertop by the Nazgul, as well as the anniversary of the ring being destroyed. Apparently, on these days, he gets delirious and kind of Gollum-like in his behavior. I thought that was really interesting. But yeah, you don't see that very often, that the protagonist of the story cannot heal from their trauma and has to leave their home. And then, of course, for him to give his house as well as everything else to Sam as a way to show his love and gratitude for his friend and companion. I just thought that was so lovely. Sam really deserves all of our love and gratitude. Oh, wait, I forgot to name my top 3 favorite characters. Okay, so Sam remains my number 1. He literally carried this quest on his back. Number 2, however, is now Eowyn. She is not particularly entertaining, but if you look between the lines, there is depth to her character. And number 3 is Pippin. Because when all of Minas Tirith is preparing for a siege, he decides to have a picnic. And that just proves what I've been saying my whole life, that there's never a bad time for a picnic. So I think we will leave this discussion here. There is, of course, so much more I could say, but I have deliberately saved some of it for my next video, as I mentioned earlier. But after that, we will be diving back into some classics again, but feel free to follow me on Instagram as I post updates there a lot more frequently. Now, don't forget, if you have any thoughts or feelings on this video or anything that I've been discussing, feel free to share those in the comments below. And don't forget to leave me a like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video. It would really make my day. Thank you all so much for watching, and I hope to see you back next time.